When you hear the word caste in India today, it probably brings to mind a pretty rigid, hereditary social ladder, right? But was it always like that? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into the surprising and often misunderstood gap between the original idea for society and the system we see today.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the idea versus the reality of caste. Then, we'll dive into the scriptural blueprint. After that, we'll check out some historical proof of power beyond birth. Then, we'll pinpoint how the system was remade. And finally, we'll explore the colonial legacy that lingers today.
All right, let's jump right in. We're starting with the main conflict, the original idea of this social structure versus the reality we see on the ground. And this gets right to the heart of it all. Where did the modern caste system actually come from?
And this is really the big question we're tackling here. Was Indian society always a rigid pyramid that was determined by who your parents were? Or is that idea actually a more recent invention?
To really get to the bottom of that, we have to go way back to the beginning. We need to crack open the original scriptural blueprint to see what the ancient texts actually had to say about how society should be organized.
Okay, so a key verse from the Bhagavad Gita gives us a massive clue. It says that the 4 social orders, or Varnas, were created based on a division of, and this is the important part, qualities and actions. Our source material really emphasizes this point. The original system was all about your personal character and the work you did, not the family you happened to be born into.
So this scriptural concept is called Varna. And as you can see, the definition is pretty clear. It's a social order based on your unique qualities, your guna, and your actions, your karma. In other words, it's about what you contribute, not who your parents were.
And this slide, well, it lays out the difference perfectly. On the left, you have Varna, which is fluid, something you can acquire based on what you do. On the right, you have the modern idea of caste, which is rigid and inherited. Our source draws a really crucial line here. One is a flexible social order, the other is a fixed social hierarchy. Two very different things.
Okay, but you might be thinking, was this just a nice idea on paper, or did it actually play out in the real world? Well, let's take a look at the historical evidence and see if people could actually move around in society.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. History is just filled with powerful dynasties that came from all corners of society. I mean, take a look. The Nanda dynasty, they came from a Barbar community, what we now call OBC. The famous Maurya emperors, linked to the Kushwaha community. And you have celebrated kings like Suheldev Pasi from a community now in the SC category, and the Gond kings from a tribal background. Clearly, holding power wasn't limited by your birth.
And you know, this social mobility wasn't just about kings and queens. It extended to the intellectual and spiritual giants of the time. The source points out that Maharishi Valmiki, who gave us the epic Ramayana, came from a clan that's now considered SC. And Maharishi Vyasa, the one who compiled the Vedas and wrote the Mahabharata, was the son of a fisherwoman. This shows that even the highest spiritual authority was accessible to anyone, no matter their background.
So if the ancient system was so fluid, what happened? How did everything become so rigid? Well, that brings us to a huge turning point in this story, a system that was completely remade by colonial intervention.
First off, let's just look at the word itself, caste. It's not even an Indian word. It actually comes from the Portuguese word casta, which means breed, race, or lineage. So right off the bat, you can see how it's tied to these European ideas about bloodlines and heredity.
This European concept was then put into practice by British colonial administrators. You had figures like Herbert Hope Risley using what was basically pseudoscience, literally measuring people's skulls and noses to classify them. Others, like William Crookes and Denzel Ibbotson, took these incredibly complex social identities and just flattened them into rigid, simple caste blocks because it made them easier to control.
And this right here is the central argument from our source material. A fluid, dynamic social system was essentially frozen solid. And the main tool they used to do this? The colonial census. It locked families into these permanent, birth-based categories for the very first time, creating the rigid system we're more familiar with today.
And that colonial project has left behind a long, messy, and very complicated legacy. So for our final section, let's look at how this history has led to some of the confusion and contradictions we see in modern India.
This is where you can really see the fingerprints of that old colonial system today. I mean, just look at these inconsistencies. The very same community can be classified differently depending on which state you're in.
Gujars can be OBC in some places and a scheduled tribe in others. Powers can be in the general category or a scheduled caste. It just goes to show how arbitrary these labels, which were created over a century ago, can be.
And our source really brings us down to a deeply human level with a powerful question. If our birth is assisted by a woman from a scheduled caste community, and our death rites are performed by a man from a scheduled caste community, how can we possibly justify differentiation in the life that happens in between?
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If the bookends of our lives, our birth and our death, can so often transcend these man-made categories, then what does that truly mean for all the pages in between?